hosts, Janet Kira and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sacred Matrix. I'm your host, Janet Kira Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Alex Lessin. I made him Salix. Sasha Alex Lessin. Our producer, Deborah DeFranco, is not with us this week, but she's having a nice vacation. And our guest today is Eric Lowans, and you're listening to Revolution Radio, Studio B. So a little bit about Eric. He is the author of a new book called That Shining Moment. And, excuse me, the book brings together a cast of unlikely partners together over two generations, beginning with the tragic assassination of a president in 1963, which this book has been thoroughly researched and realistically presented. The reader is absorbed in both the period and the action as the characters are inextricably linked by their search for truth. While this is a work of fiction, it is based on research and interviews conducted through the years and may be closer to reality than the world would like to believe. We're going to let our author, Eric Lowans, tell you all about the story that happened with that famous president in 1963. And today is the anniversary. And what is it, 57 years ago?
57 years.
So while some of us are old enough to remember, and I'm going to start with Dr. Lessin. First of all, what do you want to say?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say about the Kennedy assassination, it's like the elephant. The more that people experience from their own perspective what it was going on, the more we learn about the elephant and also about the people that are saying what they're feeling and what their motives are in saying what they're saying. So this is just such a fascinating subject. I just can't wait to hear what you're going to tell us, Eric. And the question is, what was everybody doing at the moment they learned about that the president had been shot? And so what I remember is I was in the elevator with one of my heroes at a convention, the American Anthropological Association convention, and there was Margaret Mead of Columbia University with a great big cane that was bigger than she was, and she walked from the elevator up to the stage, and she said, "The president's been shot, he's dead, and we're going to carry on just the way he would have wanted." And then she went on with, that's what I remember.
Welcome to our show, Eric.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure.
Our pleasure, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, we were just chatting before we picked up on this show here. I tell people that my alibi is that I was in the third grade in Orlando, Florida, and we were singing in a choir. I don't remember the teacher's name of the song we were singing, but something came over the old crackly PA system, and we heard President Kennedy, and she shushed us all. We stopped singing, and then they said, "School's out." So she left. She came back in the room a few minutes later and told us that the president had been shot in Dallas, Texas. So that is pretty much how we found out about it. And from there...
And I was in the third grade, too, in Pittsburgh. And there was a knock at the door. The teacher went out, and she came back in sobbing. So I guess they told all the teachers personally. And then, of course, we all went home. So what got you interested in this subject that you wrote a book, and now we're here today? And what different perspective can you bring to the table?
It's a great lead question.
And were you really a fireman? That's what I want to know, too.
No, I was not, actually. My background was in the military and in police work, so I knew a lot of firemen, but I've never put out the first fire myself. The characters that you read about in the book that are fire department are they're fictitious characters, but they're basically composites of people that I've met through my life that have some sort of input into the storyline. And I point out in my prologue that, like all good stories, this story started in a bar in Washington, D.C. about 26 years ago. Had left police work full time. I was a security director for a defense contractor, and we were a friend and mentor of mine named Bob had been in the CIA, had left, started his own company down in Manassas, Virginia, and we were using his firm to help us track some stolen product throughout Russia, what had been the Soviet Union.
Could you talk a little bit more into your mic, because you're a little bit breaking up?
Oh, I'm sorry. I get closer here. So, we're
closer.
Is that working?
That's better. Yes.
All right. So Bob and I, we talked shop for a while, and he was always an interesting person to talk to because he always knew what was going on with the electronics, the nano robotics and stuff, and that was very exciting for me. But I was not a science guy. I was a behavioral sciences major, psychology and sociology. So it was funny that most of the stuff that government agencies were working on at the time was actually already out in the public domain in magazines like Popular Mechanics or Popular Science. And they had one called Aviation Week in Space Technology. I don't know if anyone on the show's ever heard of that, but the joke around the federal agencies in Washington was they called it Aviation Leak in Space Technology, because just about the time they would start a secret project, somebody would write about it and have pictures of it that you could buy on the newsstand. So he was filling me in on some of the more exciting stories of the day, and we got to talking, and I think it was about the third or fourth drink. Nobody kept score. He mentioned that, and let me backtrack about Bob. He was a Marine Corps guy, worked in RF radio communications, was in Vietnam, entered the, I don't want to get sued by anybody, so we'll just say that big agency in Langley, where he worked for a number of years, and then he started his own company. After about that third or fourth drink, he said, in my travels, he goes, I was at the same base in Japan that Oswald had worked at. And I said, no kidding. At the same time, he said, no, it was after Oswald. But he goes, there was some discussion about it. And I said, well, I was always intrigued by it. In college, I wrote term papers, essays, thesis about the Kennedy assassination. So I was intrigued. And he said, you follow the Warren Commission? I said, yeah, I read it. I actually have a copy of it. And he said, there was evidence that never made it to the Warren Commission. And by this time on 3 or 4 drinks, how can you not want to listen to that? So he mentioned some stuff that at the time seemed difficult to swallow. And then through the years, more and more people have researched various elements of the assassination. They've gone back and re-interviewed people. And as most of the listeners know, the Warren Commission said in 1964 that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy pretty much to the exclusion of all others. And up until 1977 or 78 when the House Select Committee on Assassinations came back and said, well, they tried their best to do a good investigative job, but there were some things that we could fault them for. They seemed focused on Oswald, not on looking at other evidence. And at the conclusion of the Select Committee, their report indicated that there was probably evidence of a conspiracy. And I think the link is in, I might have sent you a different copy. Anyway, you can go into the House Select Committee report and see how it's carefully worded to say that we're pretty sure the mafia didn't do it. We're pretty sure that U.S. government agencies didn't do it. And we're pretty sure that Castro didn't do it. But that doesn't rule out individuals working for those organizations. Now, for a bunch of attorneys sitting around in D.C. on the public payroll, you would think that if they were really pushing a slam dunk, that they would have had a more finite, more descriptive response for the final report. So that just kind of, I think, fueled the fire. And since 1977,
also they were aware that JFK was in power and he was the guy who had the power over them.
That's true too. I mean, you can take a look at who the members were on the Warren Commission, and that I think Oliver Stone tried to bring that out in a fictional account of it. Other people have reported on that, and back in the early 70s, I think there was a movie with Burt Lancaster called Executive Action that even spoke to that. The people that had somehow been tapped to be on this Warren Commission. And so moving forward, I got my hands on as much as I could about it. And at the end of it all, I remember I was in Detroit and I finished reading a book called Mortal Error by Bonar Menninger and a guy named Howard Donahue. And Donahue had actually been one of the experts who had test-fired the Mannlicher Carcano rifle to see if Oswald could have fired those shots in Dallas, and the answer was yes. Donahue was able to duplicate that performance. But if you look at Menninger's results, his report, dealing with the forensics, it's simply, Lee Harvey Oswald was definitely on the 6th floor of the school book depository that day, but there's some question as to whether or not the ballistics would support the fact that that head wound that everybody talks about was caused by 6.5 millimeter ball ammunition. And by ball ammunition, for people that are not into firearms, that's a fully metal jacketed bullet, not designed to expand, but basically to penetrate. I'm sorry, was that a question?
No, it was impossible for the forensics to be explained by the weapon that Oswald had.
Correct. They basically had some fragments left over from the floorboard of the car, which by the time the FBI got to it in Washington had already been cleaned up. So there were some fragments in the car. There was, of course, what they have since referred to as that pristine bullet that was found on a stretcher and was handed to a Secret Service agent that seemed to tie to Oswald. But other than that, there was nothing about that head injury that said, yep, Lee Harvey Oswald did it. So again, that kind of fueled the fire to develop more information about it. So in those years, people have asked, do I think that he acted alone? Do I think that anybody in particular killed him for a particular motive? And as I say in my prologue, rather than speculate openly, what I have said is everybody listening should check out 2 books. One is that Bonar Menninger's Mortal Error, and the other book that I push people to is Best Evidence by David Lipton. Came out, I want to say, around 83 or 84. They don't focus on why somebody did it or the who so much as what does the evidence tell you. And if you take a look at David Lipton's book, David Lipton was an engineer, and he might have gone to law school at some point afterwards, but he took a look at the evidence in the Warren Commission report and kind of reconstructed what the evidence shows happened all day long, November 22nd, up until that night at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And when you take a look at Lipton's book, you close the book and you go, wow, there is no way this could have happened. It just does not make sense this way. And again, it just causes you to be a little bit more curious about it. So when you add Menninger's book, if you add Lipton's information, that again, Lipton took only from the Warren Commission exhibits. He did not interview extra witnesses. He didn't try to paraphrase anybody. He said, on page such and such of the Warren Commission, this is exactly what happened. This is when Kennedy's body arrived. And actually, Lipton points out that there was evidence that Kennedy's body arrived 3 different times at Bethesda Naval Hospital. The one guy who saw Jackie in the casket coming through the door was already walking to the lab with a pot that had Kennedy's brain in it. He said, there's no way I could have had his brain if he was just coming through the front door. So just a lot of things like that the Warren Commission overlooked, which is sloppy investigation. So again, I'm not saying who did it or why. I'm just saying that the evidence.
What about whether that was his body or whether it was the cop who looked just like him? Because that was. Did you ever hear that story?
If you're talking about J.D. Tippett, I've heard that, but I think I'm pretty sure J.D. Tippett's body never left the Dallas morgue. I would almost bet on that. So and that's where we get into where the forensics, where the process is handled correctly in Dallas. And no, because the Secret Service immediately seized Kennedy's body, would not let an autopsy take place. They made sure they got the body back to Washington as soon as possible. That was in direct violation of the law. And this is not me talking. This comes from, again, Menninger's book and Lifton's book, and dozens of other authors have already pointed this out. They made a beeline to put the body back on Air Force One, to the point they were in such a hurry the casket did not fit. If you remember, it's a 707 aircraft. There was a forward hatch start on the port side and a rear hatch, an aft hatch. They had to actually take the handles off of the casket to force it through the door. They had to take a couple of seats out on the port side in the aft section so that the casket would fit. So this was not something that was thought through. This was more like, let's do this and get out of here. Certainly not the way you would expect the body of a president to be handled. So again,
what was it? What do you think was behind the urgency to do that?
I can't speculate on that without stepping over some lines. I don't have any solid information. My thought is there was a little bit of angst because, and again, going back to Menninger's book, when the Secret Service called the White House to talk to Bobby Kennedy, Menninger said that the quote was, Mr. Attorney General, there's been a terrible accident. He didn't say your brother was murdered, your brother was shot, your brother was assassinated. The verbiage that the agent used when he called Bobby Kennedy that afternoon was, there's been a terrible accident. And I don't know if you're familiar with Menninger's book or not. It's been out about 20 years, but what Menninger is basically drawing a conclusion to, and let me back up just 1 second. Everybody who's followed the Kennedy assassination has at one point or another seen the Zapruder film. I've taught executive protection in a number of programs for police and military and corporate security people for the last 25 years, and that's one of those films that it's a must watch. If you look at the fatal headshot in stop action, frame by frame, and I don't want to be too graphic for your listeners, but there is a conical spray of blood and fragments that come out at an angle to the front. And there's even a halo. If you enhance the image or take a good close look at it, you will see an angular conical spray going forward with a halo, which means a high pressure impact from the rear. Well, if you're a geometry student, if you bisect the angle of that cone and draw a line straight back, it doesn't go back to the 6th floor. It goes back to an elevation that would be about where the follow-up car was during the shooting. So Menninger's claim was that during the excitement... Say again?
You said the elevation where the car following was? Is that what you said? I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Like the grassy knoll.
No, the grassy knoll was in front of and to the right of the limousine. The car that was behind the limousine was the follow-up car. I think it was a 1957 Cadillac convertible with running boards built in. They had agents standing on the running boards. Of course, Clint Hill, who was Jackie's bodyguard, was on the left front portion of the running board. At the first sound of gunfire, he jumped off and ran forward. He's the agent that you see in the movies trying to get on the back of the limousine. That's Clint Hill.
Right.
He was not JFK's bodyguard. He was Jacqueline's bodyguard. So he happened to be the first on it. Well, in that car were other Secret Service agents, and 2 of the agents were sitting on the back, on the convertible top, with their feet on the seat. Menninger's claim is that as the car slowed and accelerated after hearing the gunfire, that the agents lost their footing and slipped. In the Warren Commission, the reports where they interviewed the agents, one of the agents does say, I reached down to pick up the AR-15 and chamber around. Well, he said, the agent interviewed said he didn't do that until after they went under the bridge to get under the triple underpass there to get on the Stemmons Freeway. But other people claim that the AR-15 was visible momentarily before they went under the underpass. So where we get into Menninger's thesis here is that if you look at the elevation where the shot came from, he says in one wild accidental moment of panic that an accidental discharge from an AR-15 behind and to the right of Kennedy caused the explosive head wound.
So you're saying that there was an agent in the car behind that, quote unquote, accidentally shot Kennedy in the head?
Correct. That's what von Armeniger's claim was. The interesting point, and I'm going from memory here, and I think he passed away. Howard Donohue's been dead for several years. Manager's claim was that this guy reached down to pick up a rifle, chambered around. The AR-15 platform, the M16 platform, was still relatively new for military and law enforcement, so it wasn't like they'd been shooting those guns for a long time. He thinks that in one split second that the muzzle happened to be accidentally pointed towards Kennedy's head, that this agent had his finger on the trigger, the jerking car might have caused an accidental discharge. So, and I don't want to mention the agent's name because it's easy to research, but the family of the agent did not sue Menninger. You would think that if that was not true, a couple things would have happened. A, you would have thought a lawsuit would have been like waiting for him the second he got home. That was not the case. The family did not sue until I think it was 4 or 5 years later, and the judge initially threw it out and said, you waited too long to file the lawsuit. Adding to that, the people that denied it when questioned at the Warren Commission was a Kennedy aide, not the Secret Service agents that rode in the followed car. They didn't publicly under oath deny it. And that leads to a little bit of speculation. And finally, the AR-15 rifle that was carried in the car that day was never made available for ballistics testing. And again, if you want the full details, it's a great book. So, and I don't make any money from selling his book, but if you read Mortal Error, if you have a forensics background, and again, I spent a lot of time in law enforcement and doing protection work, I remember closing that book going, wow, that sort of makes sense. So I could be way off.
What would the detritus from that kind of a shell look like in the stuff that they did sweep up from the bottom of the...
Excellent question. As we referenced earlier, Oswald's rifle had 6.5 millimeter ball ammunition, fully copper jacketed. At the angle that Kennedy's head was tilted, if it had entered on that right rear occipitus, it should have come out his jaw because the sixth floor book depository was probably 70 foot elevated. The spray that was caused by an explosive round, the type of ammunition that Secret Service were carrying in their rifles happened to be frangible. It was designed to break up on them. So the type of injury was more consistent with frangible ammunition than ball ammunition. So, and again, I love those guys. I work with Secret Service people. A lot of my friends are Secret Service guys, and there is no better protective agency in the world than the Secret Service. But that explanation does begin to fill in some blanks and explain why some of the behaviors were curious to so many people.
Wow. So, you, of course, have this work of fiction. Quote,
thank you for saying that.
and you have the backstory of this Bob in a bar, and then I was reading it that there's an alternative video, or not video, what do they call it? 8 millimeter movies back then.
Yeah.
Is that real? Is that a just made up part, or is that a real?
Well, on 3.5 drinks, 25 years ago, 26 years ago, he seemed to think that was a pretty real thing. Now, here's the thing that I would steer your listeners to if you're aficionados of this. I think it was the Nix film. Orville Nix was standing in the plaza, filming north, and he was on the opposite side of the street of Abraham Zapruder. Orville Nix's film, and again, I've never seen the original. I've only seen what you can see on YouTube that's been pieced together and quote-unquote stabilized. The stabilization process means that some photographic expert has manipulated the images in sequence so that it doesn't look like a jerky camera. The intriguing thing about this, and I can send you the link to this, the intriguing thing about the Nix film is that you capture during the moment of the shooting and just after, when we see Clint Hill rush up to the car, all you see is the front of the Cadillac follow-up car. The image cuts off before you see the rear of that follow-up car where those other agents were seated. So I always found that weird, that here's a guy that's capturing this action, here's a follow-up car that's right behind, but the way the image was finally released to the public, it does not show the back half of that Cadillac.
Does it show what happened with Connolly?
Yeah, well, here's the thing about Connolly, and not to dispute Jim Garrison, rest his soul. The Garrison, brought out by the Oliver Stone movie, Garrison tried to make it look like this bullet was dancing around in midair, and it didn't. If you look at the top-down view of the presidential limousine, what you would see is there's a front seat where the driver and the Secret Service agent sat. There were two jump seats, fold-down seats, where Connolly sat on the starboard side and Nellie, his wife, sat on the port side, which left and right. And immediately behind them was Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. Right? Now, if you take a look at the top down, you'll see that the jump seats are actually spaced inwards a bit. And Kennedy's rear seat in that limousine, it was a 1961 Lincoln Continental, I think, if you want to look it up. Kennedy's seat had a jack underneath of it, so you could actually raise the seat, and that way he could get a better view of people waving. So that was an option that was built into the presidential limo. So Kennedy's rear seat was actually higher. Connolly's seat was not immediately in front of him. It was more to the left. So when you look at Kennedy after the first shot through the throat, you can see he's leaning downwards as Connolly is turned around trying to look over his shoulder. And that is what lines up that 6-4 shot perfectly. There's been a couple of documentaries about that where they've used other experts. They've used laser to show the path of a bullet. And actually that magic bullet is nothing, there's nothing magical about it. That shot came from the 6th floor of the school book depository.
Wow.
So, did you, okay, so go ahead. Take us where you want to take us. I mean, there's a lot of directions we could go with this.
Yeah, let me just say,
to,
that was the basis, because what I put together in this book is based on talking to Bob and some other people. There probably could have been, let's say that, another movie that was shot from the post office, which was across from Dealey Plaza. It was a long way off, probably a couple hundred yards. And the assertion was that somebody was on top of that. Now, the post office was also the building for government offices at the time, which included the FBI, Defense Department, all the Army, the military recruiting stations were there, and that sort of thing. Immediately across the street, due east from the post office building, was a building under construction. It was all girders, steel, people working, noisy. So you could have had people filming from either of those locations, and when they realized what they had, they were reluctant to bring it forward, because what in the book, and I don't want to jump ahead here, in the book, what the video shows is a downward view of the 6th floor showing Lee Harvey Oswald in the sniper's nest, but for a split second, there's a guy stacking boxes behind him with a short-sleeved shirt. So that means he wasn't by himself the whole time. Immediately before the shooting, there was somebody standing behind him. So now that's the teaser. The other part of it is that's not what drives our characters crazy. What drives the characters crazy in the book is there's a cut in the film, and then all of a sudden the film opens up again, and it's obviously the cameraman is running across asphalt somewhere. When he picks the camera up again, it's no longer Dealey Plaza, it's an airport somewhere. And in the background is the big red and white striped water tower that all the military airfields had of the day. And what they see on the second part of the same film is two flying saucers landing at a military airbase. There you go.
Wait, say that again. Two flying saucers landing where?
At a military airfield. On the back end of the film that catches the JFK assassination from a different angle, it shows two flying saucers landing in front of a bunch of generals. Now that story is taken from two realistic stories happened at two different air bases a couple of years apart. And you can research those too.
So you're saying that the person filming the Kennedy assassination stopped filming, and then he later picked up the same camera, same roll of film, and continued and got the saucers landing.
Correct. Isn't that a fun book?
Okay. Just make sure I was hearing that. So, okay. And was this one of the known landings that people have in ufology, or this was another landing?
We don't specify.
This isn't one of the common stories, or?
Yeah, this is a common story, but we don't specify in the book which air base. We just say an Air Force base, because we know that Eisenhower was alleged to have visited a couple of Air Force bases to witness aerobatics landings.
So, but if it's after the Kennedy assassination, is this landing, was this for Johnson?
No, it was the same day. Johnson was on his way. He was on Air Force One headed back to Washington.
So who was the landing for? You have the principal characters, the dead president and the next president. Who were the saucers meeting with? Who were the ETs meeting with?
Well, they were doing something in the room with the body, I bet you.
Well, let's hear what.
No, they're on a flight line, and they're applauding as if this had been planned for some time. And it's from the images you can see that there's green uniforms and blue uniforms, meaning Army and Air Force. From the braid on their caps, you can see that they're all flag grade officers. That means they're generals and above. So we know now that
right.
As these guys on November 22nd, after Kennedy has been shot, they're standing on a flight line watching UFOs land, and it was anticipated because it's like they're putting on an ear show for them.
And does anybody have any information on what the that ET meeting was about?
No.
No. Come on.
The whole process.
I mean, a lot of these things leak out, but, we have...
Kennedy was going to disclose the ET presence, and that's worries some people.
Absolutely. Have you read the book?
No,
if you look at
that book down.
Yeah, if you look at the cover of the book, I kind of spill the beans right on the cover because there's two documents on there that the FBI later said were complete forgeries, but Stanton Friedman, who passed away last year, had his forensics people said no, they're genuine government documents. And what it was
okay. I have to blow this up. I can't read it.
Yeah, 2 weeks before Kennedy was killed, he sent a memo around saying, I want to start sharing UFO files with the Russians. When we go into space, we want to make sure that we're working together, and so that we understand we're not spying on each other. We all know what each other is doing. And that was 2 weeks before he was killed. There's another memo, and I'll tell you where you can find these documents. Let me look on the thing here. I think it's right. If you go to majesticdocuments.com /documents. You're going to see them. The author of this website has put them all together in nice PDF fashion so that you can take a look at them. Some are heavily redacted, obviously, because they had some sort of classified data. But I leaked that out right on the cover of the book that the motive for the assassination was because he was going to start sharing stuff with their biggest enemy at the time.
Right, and the internal enemy was Alan Dulles.
I don't specify him by name, but after the assassination, I think it was John McCone was the CIA director because Dulles had been fired by Kennedy.
What people have said is that there was a memo which was the incoming defense person would say, Operation so-and-so should go into effect if thus and thus and thus happens. And so McCone didn't really know what it was, but he just passed it on. That's one story. Have you heard that one too?
That's pretty close, because there's one document that says he refers to Kennedy as Lancer, which was his Secret Service.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So the documents are out there for anybody to see. Some of them were recovered from the National Archives. And the FBI, scrambling to come up with an answer, said, well, it's obviously part of a hoax, and somebody put those into the National Archives so that ufologists would find them, which is, if I was the FBI, I would probably say that too. But by that time, the toothpaste was out of the tube because the forensics examiners who looked at them said, well, if they were hoaxes that went into the file in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s because it's that paper, it's those typewriter type strikings, it's cloth ribbons, it's U.S. government letterhead and things like that. So there's just also, let me just back up for a minute. In my prologue, I mentioned my career in police work. We learned that there's two types of burdens of proof. In a criminal court, you have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt to get a conviction. However, in civil court, it is just a preponderance of the evidence. In other words, you got 12 people on a jury that didn't have anything else better to do that week, so they're going to do jury duty. If you make them believe your side is true, that's a preponderance of the evidence. So when we talk about documents or witness interviews or photographs or video or anything, the paid skeptics always jump right out and say, well, that could have been forged, that could have been photoshopped, that could have been this or that. And my first question to skeptics is always, please tell me where you were standing when this event occurred. If you weren't standing there, then you have no idea what you're looking at. So I think we should all be scientific skeptics. We should all question things. But there comes a point when some of the things that skeptics say about, like the materials that we just discussed, the copies of documents or images, have they been modified? There comes a point when even the wildest skeptic has to say, okay, maybe you've got a point. And we talk about...
There's also Occam's razor. The points you're making explain the data better than other, and brings all kinds of things together in an efficient way, which this other bullshit doesn't.
Correct. And again, you have to step back in time. For those of your listeners that aren't of a certain age group, they don't know what it was like in 1963. It was kind of, it was after World War II. Hoover had totally reorganized the FBI to chase spies as opposed to counterfeiters and whatnot. Hoover was in competition with the CIA. He did not see the other government agencies as allies. He was trying to get power, and of course, when Lyndon Johnson took over, he did something unprecedented with Hoover. He made Hoover FBI director for life. There were no other presidential appointments except Supreme Court justices were for life. But he made Hoover an appointment.
Yeah, Hoover had something on everybody.
That might be why he got appointed for life. Yeah.
Pretty much. Hoover had a lot of really exciting JFK stories, too. I can't mention his name, but I worked with a guy that was a retired agent, and he had actually run their physical fitness program up in D.C. And there was a talk. there was a story going around that Bobby Kennedy wanted to use the gym. This guy's name was George. And George said, well, Mr. AG, this is for credentialed FBI agents only. He goes, well, I'm the Attorney General. I want to use the gym. Well, he called Hoover to get his blessing. Hoover said no. So he wouldn't let Bobby Kennedy use the gym. That's how. Yeah, there's a little bit of abrasion in that relationship. And then I think that actually started from, if you can believe this story, that Hoover came into his office one day and there were some phone people installing a telephone. And he says, what's this? And they said, well, this is a hotline to the Attorney General. Whenever, Mr. Kennedy wants you, he'll just call you on this phone and you can go down and see what he wants. Hoover had the phone taken out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there, wow. And that even goes back further. You guys have heard the story that when JFK, I think he was a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the other services, he was supposedly having meetings, dates, whatever, with a female in Washington, D.C., attractive and alluring, but she was also a Nazi spy. And Hoover had her under surveillance, and, here's a naval officer comes bouncing out of her room one night, and they take down the license number. And, again, this came from my friend George. George says, yeah, Hoover has the license number checked out, finds out who it belongs to, and he went to Joe Kennedy, who I think might have been ambassador to England. I'm not sure what year this was. He went to Joe Kennedy and said, listen, we got a problem. If we can find this out, the Germans and anybody else can find this out, that your son is playing house with this woman who's giving secrets away to the Germans. So lo and behold, they were actually grooming Kennedy's older for the presidency, for politics. They send JFK to the Pacific on a PT boat that gets shot out from under him, and he becomes a hero. In the meantime, his brother dies in a plane crash somewhere in Europe during World War II. So that's how JFK kind of came to power. And if you think back to what the Kennedys did to make their money, they obviously had some connections on both sides of the street.
Absolutely.
So does this all tie in with Marilyn Monroe's story? And I just wondered while you were talking, it dawned on me that maybe, Bobby's and John's assassinations have some kind of ultimate tie.
That's a very good question, and it's funny. I was just asked that question by somebody else, and my interest in Marilyn Monroe was not that deep. And what I can tell you is, based on what I've heard or read, JFK dated her for a while. My understanding was the night she sang "Happy Birthday" to him in public, and that she was wearing a dress that had to be sewn on her, had to be stitched on her, no zipper. JFK decided she was getting too close. His political career couldn't handle that kind of fallout. So Bobby Kennedy ended up seeing her for a while, and this is purely conjecture. So if the Kennedys are listening, please forgive me. So Bobby evidently had a couple of meetings with her, and when he was ready to break it off, they used Peter Lawford as an emissary. And Lawford was actually her friend. He was another Hollywood insider. And apparently she called Peter Lawford on the night that she overdosed. So the question was Bobby Kennedy in L.A. that night? And some witnesses say that Bobby Kennedy was in Los Angeles the night that she overdosed. And so I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for you.
I once had a friend that we did regressions, and she believed she was Marilyn Monroe, and she acted. I mean, when I saw her before, the first thing out of my mouth was, we said hi. I met her at a job, and I said, do you believe in reincarnation? Because she was just so much like Marilyn's energy. And I followed Marilyn as a little girl, right? And so she said yes. And then I started saying, well, how did you suicide or were you murdered? And she started telling me this whole story of how she died at Marilyn. And she said that Bobby was there and Ted and a doctor that was, nobody knew, she didn't know who the doctor was. And that Bobby was trying to talk her out of something, like telling that she was going to tell. And Ted put a pillow over her head, and then the doctor came and put a tube down and just shoved all these pills into her. Anyway, then she said she shot out of her body, and she was floating around watching the scene, and then she ran into the open mirror that was left open in the bathroom, and she was a ball of light, which I've had other people say after near-death experiences that we often appear as a ball of light. And then she said when she went on to the next thing, she ended up going into a craft, a UFO. And anyway, so it was like all these strange things, but over the years I've kind of dismissed that. This is like 20 years later. And it just makes me wonder. Because she kept wanting to write to Ted. She said, she wrote a letter, she says, I know what you did. She was going to call him out on how he murdered Marilyn. But I wondered if anybody ever pieced that, if that was maybe even a possibility, one of the hypotheses that Teddy came in and because she was going to talk.
Well, also that the director that we talked to said that Marilyn was wired because she had been with Arthur Miller, who was a communist, and so they knew that Bobby was in trouble, and they sent people to get not Bobby. They knew Robert was in trouble, and so they sent his people to cleanse L.A. of his presence before they let the cops come and see.
And they cleaned the house too. Yeah. Anyway, that was a movie about Marilyn Monroe, produced by, and I forget his name, Paul Davids.
Paul Davids, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a fascinating story. All these little sub-stories. But go ahead, your turn. What were you going to say?
No, I was going to say that there was one documentary, they interviewed a pathologist who looked at her autopsy and then tried to do tests. They found a lot of bottles turned over on her nightstand, and as if to give the impression that she had OD'd on these pills. And what he found was, in order for her to have taken a lethal dose to cause death, there would still be X amount of capsules and particles in solution in her stomach, and there were none. So they said that the only other way to introduce that would have been either IV, intravenous, or rectal infusion. So I read that. I can't remember who put that theory together, but I did see in the last couple of years, some pathologists had gone back and said, it's just not possible to die from this and not have any residue of the pills in your stomach, because at the moment of death, you quit digesting. So that would mean that there should still have been some of the concoction in her stomach that was undigested, and they found none.
Yeah. Well,
and then they killed Dorothy Kilgallen, who she confided in.
Right. These pieces.
Yeah. Well, Dorothy Kilgallen was a big UFO buff too, and she had. I think Marilyn did make a comment to either Bobby or Jack that, hey, I'm going to blow the lid off. I'm going to start talking. Well, Kilgallen was supposed to have had some sort of government insight, not only here, but I think in the United Kingdom, a high-ranking military officer, and she was going to go public about UFOs.
Wow.
So there's the all these things, pieces to tie together. We're going to be coming up on our break in 7 minutes, and then take a 4-minute break for the commercial break and be back for the second half. We haven't even begun with a lot of parts that are in your book. So what would you like us to know and kind of give us a cliffhanger for part 2 in the next 7 minutes here?
Well, you did an excellent job of promoting this program, and I thought, you got the key points on there. Let me just talk about this real fast. First, as I think everybody that's listening would agree, the JFK assassination was never really solved to everyone's satisfaction. So we know that the Warren Commission blamed Lee Harvey Oswald, and later the House Select Assassination Committee would modify that ruling. So we know that's out there. We know that there's still some questions after all these years, 57 years later, that nobody really believes the Warren Commission. Nobody really knows what the true motive was. So that's a cliffhanger. Now, the second thing I would point out is UFOs are real. Stan Friedman has said it. Paul Hellyer has said it. Paul Hellyer was former Canadian defense minister, and he was probably the highest political person to ever speak outwardly about UFOs. And the question we should be asking is, where are they from? Are they ours? Are they from another star system? Are they from another dimension or another time? And if you think back at Jim Penniston, if you go back to, what year was that, 1984, over in England, that was the Charles Hall story. Mm-hmm. Remember the base over there? Jim Penniston was actually one of the air policemen that touched the craft that the skeptics said, well, it's just a lighthouse light that's 15 miles off. Penniston actually touched the craft and received some kind of psychic message from it that they were us from the future. So there's a witness that I believe, preponderance of the evidence, I believe Sergeant Penniston says that. That was his feeling, that they were us from another time. But Hellyer tells us, listen, there's not just one group of extraterrestrials that visit here. There's 7 or 8 different groups. There could be 80 different species. And he was exposed to classified information for the duration of his employment up in Canada. So you have to give him a listen. He was a very, very high profile guy, very educated fellow, not at all afraid to talk about it. So according to Hellyer, there's a lot of different aliens running around. Some could be us from the future. Some could be from other star systems or other dimensions. So that's part of it. But we tie that together and we say, look, remote viewing works. The experts who retired from the government program that was started by Stanford Research back in the 70s, they've retired now. Well, the government said that they ended the project in 1995. Well, we talk about classified programs in the prologue and how people changed the name of the project and the clearance levels and stuff. But where I'm going with this is, read some of their books. Russell Targ is a physicist, but he writes like a physicist. It was a little over my head. Joe McMoneagle is a former... Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, Russell Targ.
Yeah, Russell Targ is one. Joe McMoneagle, I've read most of his books. Fascinating stuff. Once you read those books, again, preponderance of the evidence, you can see what kind of remote viewing, what kind of results that these folks turned out. And people say, well, it's not accurate. Well, it's not 100% accurate, but neither is your flu vaccine, right? So it was useful. It was useful in intelligence work for all those years. It was useful in criminal investigations for all those years. Not every time, and not everybody can remote view as well as everyone else. It's like golf. Some people pick it up and are really good at it, and some people are going to dump them into the trees every time. But you can still teach remote viewing. And I mentioned the Farsight Institute, the Monroe Institute. So the point is, remote viewing works. Now, when government says, we didn't get anything out of it, we ended the program. Really? Well, a word on those programs is that when the government gets tired of something, they outsource it. So when you read the books and look these guys up on LinkedIn who wrote the books, you will see the companies that they now work for, which are big government contractors. So the government is telling you the truth when they say we got out of the business. True. But that doesn't mean that they had no faith in it and they aren't still subcontracting the work to government contractors.
Yeah, they're still working. I had a friend that they were trying to recruit him, and he was afraid to go allow himself to be recruited because he was afraid he would disappear forever. So,
well, that's the Pat Price story. if you followed Pat Price, I think that was the story there. Didn't he disappear from a hotel room, or they said he died of a heart attack in Las Vegas? Pat Price was an ex-cop. He was one of the psychics at Stanford Research.
Well, yeah, there's another sub-story on that. We hear that when they disappear, sometimes they're shipped into the secret space program and different things like that. So, I mean, you keep going further and further down this rabbit hole and connecting the dots, and, you know, it's unlikely that we're going to resolve it until there's full disclosure. And when you get these documents, they're always blacked out. So what are they hiding? And is there a document somewhere that isn't blacked out? Where are those? Where are the ones that don't have all the blackouts?
That might give us some good discussion when we come back, because each president has had varying degrees of interest in the program. And cut me off here if we're out of time, but you think back that Truman was probably at the seat of it after the Roswell crash in 1947. Here's a guy that sold suits, and then he was the vice president, then he was the president. And if you look at the relationship between him and Roosevelt, Truman didn't know about the Manhattan Project until after Roosevelt died, and he said, "Mr. President, we've got this." So that's how well they kept that secret. So when he pushed that off on his successor was Dwight Eisenhower, former 5-star general, now commander-in-chief. So we're going to assume that Eisenhower had a pretty good understanding of what was going on.
Oh, yeah.
And that's our music, so please mute for the next 4 minutes, and we'll be back in 4 minutes.
All right.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Join Revolution Radio every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Studio B for Momentary Zen with host Zen Garcia at freedomslips.com, the People Station.
This is Thomas, a.k.a. a Mad Painter. I'd like you to join me Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Open Canvas. Don't forget to bring an open mind.
Yes, folks, that's right. Bring an open mind to an open canvas. Again, that is Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern. UFOs to government corruption. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We've got to stop them! They're going to kill us all! See how the trouble you've started? Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well, now you got it. Right, you tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio. All right, thanks for listening while we took that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
Aloha and welcome back to the Sacred Matrix. I'm your host, Janet Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Alex Lessin. And today we are interviewing Eric Lowans, and we're talking about the Kennedy assassination and UFOs. Before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to please go up to revolution.radio to the tab at the top and make your one-time donation, or go to the Patreon button and make your recurring donation. And we do appreciate you very much, and thank you for donating and helping us stay on the air. Okay, what would you like to say, Dr. Sasha?
Well, for one thing, I'm somewhat. I see a parallel between the story of the English king who says to his nobles, "I wish somebody would get rid of that guy Beckett." And so my question, I guess it's the existential question, is who benefited by Kennedy's death? And then we get this multiplicity of people that were pissed at Kennedy.
Yeah.
Back to you, Eric.
Yeah. Well said. And to go back and quote Paul Hellyer, I mentioned him before the station break there. Paul Hellyer was a former Canadian defense minister, and he was the first person that I recall in such a high position that used the word cabal. He mentioned in some of his books organizations, and I won't mention them here today because it's real easy to find them on Wikipedia, organizations that are behind the scenes controlling pretty much the government. Because elected officials, politicians, are here for 4 years or 8 years and then they're gone. The way the cabal would work, according to him, is that they're looking for people that have been in key stable positions for 25 or 30 years so that they continue to manage the planet from behind the scenes. And all I'll point out is, gee, if you were researching this on the internet and found, everybody remembers who Jeffrey Epstein was, sort of found himself hanged, 6 months ago in New York there?
So they say.
So they say. Fake. Yeah, I have an alibi for that night too, guys. I wasn't anywhere near there. So the thing I would say is, if you look up Epstein, you will see that he actually served on one of these organizations that has been listed as being part of the cabal. I always found that amusing. So if you're reading the book and happen to see a connection or some sort of tie and go, wow, that could be just like so-and-so, well, it could be because that's true. We don't use his name in the book, obviously, out of sensitivity to the family and litigation. So you ask a great question, but let's go back to how many people would really know about this? And we mentioned again before the station break that Truman kind of inherited it. If you go back to the original Roswell crash and what happened afterwards, or even before, you see that Truman got something dumped on him, and he was still in the White House, I think, in 1952 when they had a rash of UFO sightings right over the Capitol. So here he is, the Air Force can't explain it, Truman can't explain it, and what's he supposed to say? So he decided to rein this in, and after 1947, we saw the development of the National Security Act, which followed with the National Security Agency, and of course, the CIA eventually came out of what was the old OSS, Wartime Office of Strategic Services. So we see intelligence agencies really getting a push after this 1947 crash. I do mention, by name in the book, Lieutenant Colonel Philip James Corso, and some of you may be familiar with him. He wrote a book called The Day After Roswell, and it was produced by Pocket Books back in 1997. And he mentions in his book that back-engineered alien technology was recovered from downed spacecraft that was being released to private industry for study to give us technological boost and to obviously compete with the Soviets. And skeptics have argued that the research and patents for all this stuff that he mentions in his book were due to the hard work and diligent efforts of the employees of these government contractors. And that's why I say, in my previous experience as a government contractor, I can see how they piece out things. If gosh, I don't want to mention other names. Big government contractors, they don't make an entire widget. If you say, I want to contract with you to build a rocket ship to go to the moon, there's hundreds of contractors that will take part in that. It's not just a Rockwell, say. I think or somebody like a Lockheed. They're going to sub all this stuff out. So from the contractor side, it's easy for me to see how you could give people a concept, scientists a concept, and say, hey, here's what we think we can develop. Put your best people on this and come up with an answer, without ever saying, this came off a spacecraft, by the way. Because if you just walked into GE, for instance, and said, this came off of a downed spacecraft, can you duplicate it? They'd say, yeah, we'll put our people on it right now. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how to do this quietly, get it into the public sector without them knowing it. So going back to Truman and Eisenhower, I think Eisenhower got fully briefed on it. If you remember some of the other stories about Eisenhower, he was once told he couldn't go to Area 51. And I don't know this from firsthand experience. This was a story told to me. Said that he wanted to go out to Area 51 because Eisenhower had supposedly been present at a couple of landings. I think one was at Edwards Air Force Base, and there was another one that followed 2 years later. And he faked, I think it was a tooth. They said he was off the grid in Palm Springs for a tooth oral surgery or something like that. There was some story, but he actually was out there on the date and time in question. So, yeah. So we go back to what Eisenhower knew, and Ike was a 5-star general. He's a career Army officer. 5-star general asked permission to go somewhere. Generals are not used to hearing the word no. So it's fully understandable that Ike would have said, I'm coming out there tomorrow with tanks or without. He told them right up front, I will bring the troops in and we will take the base by force. That's the story I've heard, and I've heard a couple of different sources. So Ike did get a tour. Now, since that time, if you look at aerial photographs, satellite photographs, that base has just grown incrementally. And if you listen to John Lear's had some stuff out there for a long time, but I go back to the physicist Bob Lazar, and you guys must have heard of him at some point because he was the guy that came out in 1989 and said, oh yeah, I was hired to back engineer propulsion systems on something at an area called S4. And he said this on KLAS TV. This is 1989. And he talked about element 115, and they all said, you're so full of crap. He's lying. He's a fraud. He's making this stuff up. Well, sure enough, element 115 was discovered like in 2009 in Dubna, Russia. So it was either A, a lucky guess, or B, he really did work on that. And when the companies that and the schools that said they didn't know him, they said, no, he never went to school here. Well, he produced pay stubs on TV that showed he worked for Naval Intelligence. He produced a phone book that had his name and department listed. So if he was a fraud, he was a really good one. And since he left the government operations, he still stayed in physics. He's doing some really wild stuff. I think he still lives out west somewhere, New Mexico or Arizona, someplace. So the point is, going back to that preponderance of the evidence, that we look at Corso's past. He was a highly decorated military officer. He spent time in intelligence in Germany right after the war, and he was also in the Foreign Technology Division, which is the division where they study, supposedly, down spacecraft, right? So Corso is making these claims in his book, and if you look at his academic, his professional background in the Army, it fits. Because, again, preponderance of the evidence, I'm thinking, I believe him. And if the skeptics, all they have is to say, no, such and such was invented by DuPont or whatever. Well, the skeptics can say that, and they probably do hold the patent or the trademark or the copyright on stuff. But how did those people get the initial concept? You know what I mean? So, having worked in a defense contractor, they're not going to tell you everything. Years ago, I was watching TV, and there was some documentary on, and they pigeonholed some senator after a budget meeting, and they said, tell us about the such and such program. And that was a program for supposedly a secret airplane capable of suborbital flight that left a really weird vapor trail, and people had talked about it, had been in all the magazines, and the senator says, it doesn't exist, I don't know anything about it, there is no such thing, and I started laughing. My wife says, what are you laughing about? And I said, well, I don't know if the plane exists or not, but I held the XYZ part for it in my hand about 6 weeks ago. So I know it exists because we were building something for it. So now I'm not a pilot, and I certainly don't have any relatives or anybody out there, so I can't tell you if they built it or not, but I do know where some parts were made for it if they wanted to build it. So we go back to that preponderance of the evidence. Who knew what and when? So, here's Eisenhower. He's trying to piece stuff together. How much did he pass on to Kennedy? My thought is he gave Kennedy a briefing, and Kennedy said, gosh, it makes no sense to try and go to fight each other in space. We ought to see what we can do to work out a peace treaty here. And this, in the meantime, of course, you've got the Cuban blockade and stuff where we're trying to keep the nuclear missiles out of Cuba, and he's got to come off strong on that. At the same time, he's got to diplomatically say, hey, what are we going to do about these UFOs? Because the Russians have had UFOs for years, too, as did Germany during the war. So the UFO thing did not start in 1947 in Roswell, New Mexico. You can go back and look at religious texts from thousands of years ago, and they're going to talk about it. But Hitler was really big into UFOs, and he was big into remote viewing. People say, well, remote viewing didn't have a military application. Well, that's bull, because how do you think they found Mussolini? Mussolini was abducted. Remember, before they hung him, he was abducted once before that, and they were hiding him in a mountain. Well, Himmler knew that, and Himmler was big into the occult back then, and he tried to engage, I think her name was Maria Orsic. It was the Thule or the Vril Society. They hired their psychics to find Mussolini, and that's the Otto Skorzeny raid. Otto Skorzeny was the equivalent of the Special Forces German officer who parachuted in and used gliders, and they took Mussolini back by force. So that's where remote viewing came in, because they said there's castles all over the place. We don't know which one to go to, and they engaged psychics. So I digress. But so
no, that's interesting.
So now we've got.
So back to the Kennedy thing. I just want to interject real quick about the Project Serpo. Are you familiar with that?
Was that Merritt and Serco? There was ground-based intelligence. You're talking about the JANAP reporting?
No, it's called Project Serpo. Dr. Lessin knows about it. Len Kasten wrote a book about it. Anyway, Kennedy was working on an exchange program with so the Greys apparently, they I don't know the whole story, but there was an exchange program where some humans went to the planet Serpo, and one of the Greys stayed on the Earth, and they were gone for a number of years. Anyway, there's a whole subscript there. If you're not familiar, I don't want to dwell on that, but okay, back to what you were saying. Sorry to
No, it's okay. It all fits together.
Right.
I think that if you look at the transition of power so now we know JFK wants to go public. He wants to take that veil down. He talked about getting away from a concept of isolationism for a country. He wanted to be a world partner. And he even mentioned that at Fort Worth at the hotel 2 hours before he was killed. He talked about, let's get away from isolationism. Let's start to work together as one people. So right up until 2 hours before he was shot, he was still talking about that. So let's say that Kennedy was pretty much fully briefed on what was going on. Now we get to LBJ. And don't know if you love him, hate him, whatever. There have been books written about LBJ, and I think one was written by a guy who was a lawyer from his law firm. That talked about all of the boxes of information that have been sealed up in the law firm all these years. LBJ, I don't think he cared. I don't think anybody was read into whether it's Magic, Jehovah, whichever project name you want to talk about. But I'm not sure that Johnson was ever fully aware of what was going on because he liked the power. He was making money from it. I won't mention the name, but he was making money from government contractors in Vietnam. Kennedy wanted to get us out of Vietnam. Johnson said, nah, not so fast. And Johnson left us in. So here's two guys from the same political party. And again, what was the trip to Dallas about? The trip to Dallas was to mend fences between key people in the Democrat Party. That's why he was working with Connally, because there had developed a rift in the Democrat Party. Kennedy wanted to take it one way, and Johnson didn't. So once Kennedy was dead, Johnson was free to take the party his own way. So, and not to get off topic, that's why I say I'm not so sure he really dug into anything. And I think as long as things were working his way, he enjoyed it. I know he didn't run that second time. I remember a speech that he said, I won't seek nor will I accept the nomination of my party, something like that. So he bailed out. But now
in existentialism, you can say that it was his at least unconscious intention to somehow save his ass because he wasn't going to be carried on the ticket anymore, and he somehow wanted, whether or not he had direct agency or not, he was into getting rid of Kennedy. Kennedy was in Johnson's way, I think.
Well, they never got along, and they had nicknames for each other. I think I think Mrs. Kennedy and the family referred to Johnson as like corn pone or something, or the country bumpkin, and they had very derogatory nicknames for each other. So it was purely a put up job. He used Johnson because he needed to be strong in the South, and I think that. And I'm not a politician. I'm a behavioral sciences guy. So
I wanted to insert something here before I get lost in the thread here. There appears to be a morality test, and one is disclosure and working with the ETs, and the ETs want us to give up our nukes, and of course that means the elimination of fossil fuel energy because they have far more efficient systems. And so the morality test is, do you do disclosure, or do you stay in this current paradigm where you make money on oil and on the pharmaceuticals? We have cures for all diseases. The secret space program has it. The ETs have it. If we go to this route of disclosure, we won't be a kind of a money-based economy. It'll be a different operating system. And so what my sources have said, all the presidents get that choice. So Clinton apparently was at this meeting. They were going to disclose there were all these ET species, all the heads of states from around the world. The Greys, the Tall Whites, the Anunnaki, the Nances, and a couple other, and all these humans came with their hybrid children. All these women came with their hybrid children. So anyway, Clinton saw the hybrids, and he said, I'm not doing it. So if you track, that was Bill. Then Bush didn't want to do it. They like the money. They like their money. They don't want to give it. They don't want to give it this system, right? And then Hillary was supposed to be the disclosure president, but something happened that she didn't. And now we've had 4 years of Trump, and he was supposed to disclose. He's Space Force stuff, and so it seems like the powers that be, they really want to put in place a president that's going to be the disclosure president. And apparently the ETs are, when we go to the cabal, that the cabal are really the extraterrestrials, probably the Anunnaki who never left and have ruled since 450,000 years ago. So that's who, and we've had other people guess that said, no, there's no real elections. The ETs, or somebody decides who's going to be the next president for about 20 years. They already decide who's going to be the president. So there's all that. So back to you.
No, kind of tying with that. Think about this. Jimmy Carter was the first president ever to have made a UFO report. He was at a Kiwanis or Rotary Club meeting. He was governor of Georgia. And he didn't see it by himself. There were a bunch of people waiting outside. It was like 7:30 at night. And I think he called it the darndest thing I've ever seen. And he thought enough of it that he wrote it up. And he sent a report to Nightcap or MUFON, whoever who was taking those reports at the time. And he said, when I get to the White House, I'm going to find out more about it. When he first got to the White House, again, it depends. I don't know this for first-hand information. This was told to me that the head of the CIA at the time said, Mr. President, you don't have a need to know. And he was partially briefed by who was the who was the CIA head at the time was Herbert Walker Bush. Bush told him that, and then Bush was replaced by Stansfield Turner. And I'm not sure how much Turner ever got read in, because when Turner went to briefing, somebody said they went into Carter's into the Oval Office right after he was supposedly briefed, and he was crying. So whatever the news was, it wasn't good. But we don't know what George Herbert Walker Bush left for him. We don't know. So when we think about it, here's the President of the United States, Carter, saying, I want to find out about this. I had a personal experience. Well, who was the next president to make a report? It was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, was flying on a twin-engine Cessna, I think it was. Him, the pilot, and one of his aides looked out, and here's a vehicle, a light, whatever, holding position off the starboard wingtips. And he got in. He wanted to see what was going on. He actually made a comment in one thing about, gee, if we were, I think it was United Nations or someplace, he said, we need to work together, because if we suddenly encountered an alien threat, is there any question that we wouldn't pull together to make this a better plan? So he made that comment, but he never released anything. So now we come to Clinton. And Clinton had said he wanted to get through to it. Webb Hubbell, I think, was his attorney general at the time. He went to Webb Hubbell when they first took office, and he said, I want to know two things. I want to know who killed John Kennedy and what's the truth about UFOs. And Hubbell wrote a book later on that said, I failed because I really couldn't tell him I couldn't tell him why JFK was killed, and I couldn't find out about the flying saucers. And I don't know if Hubbell's still alive. He'd be a good guy to talk to. But so Clinton did have an interest in getting to the bottom of it. But again, he was in Ireland and made a speech that's probably out there on YouTube now, that some kid named Ryan said, hey, what's the deal with the Roswell crash? And he, from the podium in Ireland, said, well, Ryan, if something landed in Roswell, they didn't tell me about it either, and I want to know. And that was it. That was pretty much how it ended. And yes, Hillary did she'd get to it.
But George Green, who gave his last show interview to us, he was one of the insiders. He created derivatives, and he was pretty high up in the government, and he was going to be a economics advisor to the next president. And he was at a meeting with Ted Kennedy, and he said, what do you mean the next president? We haven't had the election yet. We haven't even decided who's going to run. And they said, oh, we already know who's going to be president. His name is Jimmy Carter. And he said, really? Well, is he a Democrat or Republican? Because, well, he's a Democrat. He said, I'm not going to work for this guy. I'm a Republican. Anyway, so we've had that story. And then Gloria Hawker, who was on our show about a month ago, she was one of the contactees that had the hybrid child that went to that meeting. And she said all the presidents were there. Clinton was there. Reagan was there. Everybody was alive in 1997. Every president that was alive was at that meeting.
Yeah, and I read, I think it was from the 1912 publication where Kissinger was there and Reagan was being briefed on the ET presence.
Well, that was in 97. Reagan had already been president.
And he asked some real intelligent questions about it.
Right, and then Nixon apparently took Jackie Gleason and showed him the bodies. So we have all these stories going all the way back to, Roswell. And there's something that happened even with Roosevelt. He had some interactions.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Jackie Gleason. I love that story because I was an Air Force brat. My dad was at Homestead. We were there, I'm going to say, 65 through most of 67. And that's when my dad got interested in flying saucers. And he did specific. It was big SAC base, a lot of B-52s and stuff, but it was really, really close to Cuba. And every once in a while, some Cuban pilot would defect and drop a MiG off or something. But the point was, that is when I first, as a kid, started hearing about the study of flying saucers, because he and my mom got really interested in it at Homestead, and I never knew why. Well, fast forward, I think it was, when was it 75-ish? The story goes that Nixon had a couple of drinks, and as a Quaker, I didn't know you were allowed to drink, but he supposedly showed up without Secret Service protection and took Jackie Gleason to Homestead Air Force Base. And having lived there, my thought, again, preponderance of the evidence, the only way Nixon could have done that is if he had been there before often enough to know where the hangar was. Because you don't just show up at an Air Force base and say, I'm the president, take me to the aliens. It just doesn't work like that. It didn't work that way in 75, didn't work when we were there. So my thought is Nixon had to have been there once or twice before. The sergeant on duty had to have, well, obviously recognized him. But the proof, going back to that preponderance, is I don't have any evidence of it, but Mrs. Gleason, and Jackie Gleason was a big aficionado. I think he had a flying saucer-shaped house up in Westchester County, New York, or someplace. He was really, really into the study. His widow came out and talked and said he did maintain his silence. He was told you can never talk about this. Gleason maintained his silence through death, but his widow said for 2 weeks after this trip with President Nixon that he was sullen, he was depressed, he drank more. He was always a big drinker, but he drank more than normal. And she said something had impacted him heavily after that visit with Nixon. Now, again, as a behavioral sciences guy, it could be he saw an alien, or it could be he showed up at a gate and a guard pointed an M16 at him and said, get out of here or I'll put a bullet in you. That would probably traumatize you too. But it's an interesting story that I've heard from more than one source, so you have to start to say, well, could it have happened? So everybody knows Nixon and Bebe Rebozo and Gleason, they all had places down in Key Biscayne, and Key Biscayne is not that far from where Homestead used to be. I think it's a NASCAR track now. But I have heard that story, and that's a great story.
And then one final thing. So Reagan was supposed to be debriefed by the who was in charge of the FBI in Reagan's administration. Anyway, they went to Camp David.
William Webster, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, they went to Camp David, and he was told all about the extraterrestrial presence and everything. He was given the inside track. So I don't know why they decided to do this huge debriefing of some, but apparently they all get the information, and it's pretty soon after they become president, after the inauguration. And there's a story that Obama, that's why he came out after he was briefed and he was told about the ETs, and another story is that they walked in. So, you're sitting there in the White House and all of a sudden these, 12 feet or 15 foot tall ET comes walking in. So Obama came out and he was shaking, and he took his daughters and he's talking to the press and the media, and he's like clinging to his kids like somebody's going to kill him. So yeah, there's a lot of preponderance of evidence. When you put all these stories together, it makes sense.
You mentioned Obama. Really good interview to watch him in is Jimmy. He did a Jimmy Kimmel show years ago, and what's really cool between being a hostage negotiator and having an academic background on behavior, my thing is watching people's nonverbal communication. 85% of our communication is nonverbal. So when you look at the Kimmel-Obama interview, Kimmel was right up there. He said, listen, I'm going to ask you this because I want to know, did you get briefed on flying saucers and stuff? And if you look at Obama's response, he's trying to smile like it's a joke, but he goes, I was briefed on stuff. And Kimmel says, well, tell me the truth. And you have to watch this interview. Kimmel says, well, tell us the truth.
I've seen it. I'm going to pull it up again now that you're mentioning it, because somebody did an analysis. They slow down the camera, and they do all the body language.
What do you see?
He's guilty as charged.
Well,
he has been.
That's the thing is that, again, preponderance of the evidence, if you look at the nonverbal communications, is he nervous and avoiding the conversation because it's a top secret matter, or because Kimmel's right, he really was briefed on UFOs, there really is something to it. And Kimmel said, well, if I was president, I love this quote, Kimmel says, well, if I was president, that's the first thing I would find out. And Obama looked at him and said, and that's why you'll never be president.
Wow. He told some kid that, if I told you about the truth, I'd have to kill you.
Right. Yeah, the kid did. Oh, that was Smith's, Will Smith's son. What's his name?
Oh, Jaden?
Yeah. Anyway, he came into the White House and Obama says, I know what you want to ask. That's a cute interview, too. Google it. It might still be up there. I know I watched them a few years back. Yeah. So, we have a little bit less than a half an hour. Where do we want to go? What direction?
I would really be curious in your analysis of the forces at work in Washington these days. What are you picking up?
Wow. There's kind of going back. Washington, D.C., and not to paraphrase President Trump, it truly has become a swamp, and that's an oversimplification. Washington, D.C. is a system in and of itself. Are they truly representatives of the people? And the first question I ask is, how much does it cost to be a governor? How much does it cost to be a representative or a senator? How much does it cost? How much do you have to spend to be the president? And this last election, I have no idea what the total thing was. I'm sure Biden spent several $100 million to get a job that pays, what, $500,000? He was making $500,000 a year doing nothing. Trump didn't even take a paycheck because he was worth how many billions? So the point is, when we face the reality, let's say I want to be governor and I need $12 million to run a campaign, and the job pays where I am $150,000 a year, let's say. Well, you could do a lot of things for $150,000 a year without spending the $12 million bucks. So it's a power that goes with it. And I know people that are elected officials, senators, Congress members, and they're good people, but after they spend time in the system, they become part of the system. They're still good people, but they become part of the system. And if you look at what we care about, we talk about polarization of the political parties, and then it came down to, well, can Nancy Pelosi keep her job? Well, then there's infighting in the Democrats, infighting in the Republicans. Half the Republicans say Trump needs to concede, and the other half say, no, stick it out. There's infighting everywhere. So at the end of the day, who's looking out for the taxpayer? I'm a taxpayer. I want to know about flying saucers. If my taxes are paying, $50 billion a year to fund a military study on whether it's remote viewing or flying saucers or whatever, I think I have a right to know that. And I always refer people to what we call the United Way. Some of you remember United Way used to send around an annual drive envelope. And the cool thing about it was, at the bottom of the envelope, you could check a box to say where you wanted your donation to go. So it just didn't go into some nebulous fund that you never saw again. If you gave them $100, you could check a box and say, I want $10 to go here or $50 to go there. Why can't we do our taxes like that? At the end of the year, when you figure out your taxes, people would not object to paying more money if they knew where the money was going. And I have always likened government to being an ordinary 12-year-old. You don't show me how you're responsibly spending my money now. Why do you want more of it? Show me what you're doing with the money and show me how you're representing the people. I'm sorry. This is a totally different book.
Look, what's implied is theft, peculation. That's what's, when there's no oversight, there's theft.
Well, the other thing that you said is they're obviously not doing it for the paychecks. They're doing it for the power. So the power or the position somehow ends up putting more money in their pockets, right? And so they're not supposed to be. There's a Emollients Act or whatever. You're not supposed to be lining your pockets, but anybody who becomes like a president ends up making, whatever, 20 times the amount they invested, or 50 times, or 100 times, or how does that equate? If you just look at it logically like that.
Well,
if you invest 12 million, become governor, what do you get in the long run?
I don't remember the guy who said it, but there's a quote out there for years: "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely."
Absolutely right.
I would credit the guy that said that. I don't remember it, but I think, and I won't go back to the Epstein thing, but here's a guy that public appearances said was benevolent. He was a billionaire. Probably half the people that he took probably thought he was somewhat crooked, but they were making money through him, so they left their money in. Then you find out what he was really like, and you're horrified. So in politics, there's a difference between the office holder and the person, but do you have to check the person at the door when you take that oath of office? We have gotten ourselves, and again, I'm old, but I'm not that old. I remember parents saying, well, it didn't used to be like this. And then every generation comes along and says, it didn't used to be like this. And our local representative, he had roommates. A lot of the representatives in Washington can't afford to live there. And they have roommates. And his roommate he was a Republican. The roommate's a Democrat. And they got along aces. They played cards. They drank beers together and stuff like that. Now I'm surprised they're not picking up axes and throwing them at each other. So as we get into this, and we can't get effective reporting. We now know that everybody in the news media has their own agenda. Some are left, some are right, and nobody's giving us fair and objective reporting. Nobody can trust a reporter to get us the facts, because now whenever they
Walter Cronkite when you need them.
Yeah, he is pushing up daisies. So when we say we don't trust our politicians, we don't trust our media, and now we don't trust the election process. What do we have left to trust? So we are in a position where if I was the alien guy, I'd say, oh, these guys got to stay in the oven and cook a bit longer because they're just not ready. So when people say, why are they not voting?
We're being pushed to have a cooperative country and a cooperative world by the crises of climate and the COVID plague, and the outcome is very obvious. The survivors will have cooperated.
Well,
die.
That's a way to look at it, because I spent time in crisis management doing security and safety work. And what I found is about every 2 or 3 years, we have a major global pandemic, and we have to prepare for it. The game plan that they argued about this time is the same game plan that they used under Obama. It's the same game plan they used under G.W. Bush. So it's like there was nothing new in how we respond. So we've had SARS, we had avian flu, we had swine flu. Now we've got COVID. And whether it's going to be a COVID 2020 or COVID 2021, you have to tune in and read a new book next month. The point is that social distancing was always one of the first steps to take. We just never, in the other pandemics, we just never got this far down the line. But I can assure you that Trump was playing from the same book that Obama and Bush did before, because the WHO and the CDC, they really haven't changed a lot of stuff. But when we look at how do you get a vaccine approved, and this is, again, I'm not a doctor, I don't play one on TV, but to get a vaccine approved takes a lot of years. When you talk about rushing a vaccine out, the FDA still has to approve it. And even if they release it in Mexico or Italy first, and God save those Italians, I think Italy got hit. Italy and Spain got crushed worse than we did over here. It takes time to do the concept, to do the laboratory testing, to do clinical trials, to get that final approval. And even then, you have to modify it. How many times do you get a flu shot and still get the flu because they said, well, we didn't get the formulation just right, or the flu kind of manifested in another way? Every year I get a flu shot. Every year I get the flu. So I have the same expectations of whatever vaccine comes out for COVID. I'm going to continue to be careful when I go to the grocery store. I'm going to socially distance. I'm going to quit kissing people on the mouth in the produce section unless I know them, and I'm going to behave myself. And if I get sick, I'm going to get better, and that's vaccine or not. Because if you look at the age,
I agree. So my thought was this is some kind of extraterrestrial takeover, or there's a whole story about the depopulation bomb and the Georgia Guidestones, where they wanted to increase the population. I think it's supposed to be 500 million, which is pretty extreme, or 500,000. But there is a story that the cabal, the powers that be, whoever they are, want to reduce the world population. So is this just a way of reducing the world's population?
Who will mow the lawn if they do that?
Yeah, well, who mowed the lawn? I don't know. Are they downsizing? Are they planning to sell the planet to some other species that doesn't need all these humans around, and they just want the minerals? I mean, there's something above. It doesn't make sense to everybody go out and die until we have half a million.
You got a couple of really good points there. And first of all, if you look at the actual mortality rate, if you're under 70 years of age, 99.98% are living. They're recovering. And if you look at the reality of the people that are dying, they're overweight, they smoke, they have a lethargic lifestyle. So it's like, who you trying to depopulate? These people are going to die. God, that's an overgeneralization, but these people are in a health risk.
Well, it's also black and brown people died. So it could be a race thing. I once had poor people. I once had a whistleblower who said that we were all given us vaccines to go to kindergarten, right? And he said, and this is about 20 years ago, he said, well, look up, and chemtrails just started. He goes, that's element B, right? So A is in your vaccination. Your original vaccination identified you by, your race and what part of the world you're from. And so once they get this, these elements into us, it can come, like polio. We took a sugar pill. I mean, that's kind of weird,
remember that.
right?
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, they can activate these. If they want certain people, like all black or brown or white or pink people or orange, they can just, coat the skies with element 2 and you're dead, or put it in the water or something. So we're thinking that we have to sit down and get a shot. But the delivery system of element 2 could be any. I mean, this is probably just their controlling their what are we? The sheeple, right? They're controlling their product. We're a resource. We're a commodity, right? That's the word I was looking for. And so, this is just animal husbandry, and we're their crop.
You don't even need a shot. There are a lot of ways of putting it right into the skin by putting a substance on the skin. You can deliver it without even puncturing the skin. Take a pill.
Oh, and then I've seen these. I mean, we're here in the jungle in Maui. I've seen some of these bugs, and they look like little robots. I mean, they could deliver it with a mosquito or something because they have the technology. So back to you.
Well, I was going to say, I'm a big fan of Ancient Aliens. I think you guys have probably heard of the series or watch it. There was an episode where they talked about the bubonic plague years ago, and they said some of the witnesses when towns, villages were wiped out, they talked about shadowy figures coming in waving a wand that had some kind of mist coming out of it. And
right.
And like I said, I don't play a doctor on TV, but so the point was there's been stories like this for a long time, and the plague was I don't know how many millions of people it killed, but we were talking percentages of the planet. So I mean, at the time that was a heavy impact to the population of the planet, almost as much as, say, the flood that most of the religious organizations will say.
That's the image of the Grim Reaper, and the Grim Reaper has that side, and that's supposed to be his sprayer, and the stories where they would spray the fields, and then the next one would have the plague.
They skipped some towns. It wasn't just a logical progression.
Oh yeah, just like in the Bible. When you mark the door, we'll skip your house. Yeah. Delivery.
That was Passover, wasn't it? Yeah, they put the blood of the lamb on the door.
All right, so skipping your house. There's another point I had, but now I've lost it. Okay, so what did you just say? You said about the delivery system, ancient aliens. Yeah, we've written some books on the Anunnaki.
And you ask, well, what would we do if everybody's dead? What would they do with the planet? And you went back to the Anunnaki, and I think it was Sitchin once said that the reason they were here, they were looking for gold. And this is not another conspiracy theory, but nobody's seen the gold at Fort Knox since like 1950. So was that the 1947 thing? Did they come here, they got their gold, and they said, you guys can stick around for another 50 years and we'll be back? I mean, you tell me.
He took the gold and went home. Yeah, so the other thing about, you said, well, they're getting better, but apparently this is cumulative. So the effects of the exposure to these coronaviruses, there's a whole series of them, appears to be cumulative, and so it actually, eventually you get the right dose and you're dead. So you might not get it, you might not die the first time, but maybe the fifth time you get it. And I knew a person in February 2018, that got one of the coronaviruses, and they died at a conference, and Sasha and I got severely ill. And then, somebody asked the other day, do you know anybody personally that died? Yeah, I know some people that died. And so people are dying. It's still a lot of people that are dying, right? 250,000 people was a lot of people. One person's one too many. It's like, this is preventable, but somehow it's spreading everywhere. So, we're a very, I guess, suicidal population, because if you catch it and you won the COVID lotto, you could be dead. So, or your mom or your kid or whatever. It's kind of weird to even have that type of mentality.
But we're developing a global distribution and manufacturing at a great speed. Anyone that has the idea that we're moving toward a singularity where computers are organizing everything in a synergistic way can see that this is pushing us along that path.
I know what I wanted to say. Maybe the exposure to these viruses, quote unquote, are a form of nanobots to change humanity. So we're being somehow borged or altered by, taking in these viruses and then passing them on through the generations. Something like that.
And neither do I play a DNA person on TV either, but I can tell you what I've learned about DNA is that we don't know what's in our strands. We have unused DNA. There's DNA floating around in our body that we don't know what it does. So is that a memory chip, or is that some form of device to help us evolve? You know what I mean? Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
It could help us evolve, yeah. It could help us devolve.
And also we may have timed latency of certain genes that are waiting for the right environmental stimuli to activate them. And I think that's what's exactly happening now. There's a major activation. There's changes. You can just feel it. The ages are changing.
Right. Back to you.
Yeah, you guys are way out of my depth at this point. This is going. I wish I had a medical degree now. I don't. It's fascinating times. And each generation.
Do you, Sasha? He has a degree in psychology and anthropology. So yeah, he's smart. He's a smart man.
I just think that every generation gets a lot more dumped on it than the generation before, stuff to deal with. So maybe that means that we're evolving that by necessity that the next generation is required to pick up and work with what they've got to keep the planet spinning.
Yeah. It's like in Prejegene's theory, it's like any ongoing system has perturbations. It's the energy going through a change, and they become more and more violent until the system breaks apart and either organizes into a higher level organization or it's destroyed.
So that's where we are. We're on the eve of destruction or evolution. Which do we choose? What can we do to facilitate? So, back to your book.
I would tell audiences it makes a great stocking stuffer this time of year, so they should buy 5 or 6 copies each.
Yes. We all need to eat.
So, yeah, I tell people I'll give you an email. If you really, really like it, write good reviews out there, and if you really, really hate it, I'll give you an email and you can complain to me personally.
Oh, that's a good thing, yes.
Hey, I'm really interested in firefighting. Do you have anything about that?
No, he said he's not a firefighter.
No, so what, you research?
Well, yeah, that's a curiosity. You made your characters brothers, and they were firefighters. What was behind that?
The story that was told to me, going back to Bob, it was a fireman back then, firefighters now, is who found the film. So we had to have a firefighter component so that film could be recovered, because the person who originally had the film that was going to give it up was killed in a fire. That was what was told to me. So I said, Rick, you're gonna have to build a story around that, and that's where that started out. So as you read through the book, you'll learn a little bit about camera systems from back then. You'll learn a little bit about development processing, in some of the stuff that today our generation, it's all digital, right? You can go out and take 100 pictures, and if you don't like them, you just delete them. Back in the old days, you had to think about what you were shooting, because you had to pack the right kind of film, color, black and white, Kodachrome, Ektachrome. You had to know something about photography, because if you wasted those shots, you couldn't get them back. And you wouldn't know if the shot came out for several days or weeks, because it took forever to process. So the key is that the angst that's caused by these two brothers, and again, they're both originally from Connecticut. One moved south on a football scholarship, and you'll get into that in the book. But what we see is nothing was automatic back then. There was no internet. If somebody had to do research, they had to go to a library to do it. You had to read. You had to talk to people.
No, we were so primitive back then.
Yeah. Well, I told my kids growing up, and they got sick of hearing it. So we had one telephone in the house. We had one TV. We had 3 stations. We had a 4th station if somebody would hold the UHF antenna and stand there while the show was on. That was life. Matter of fact, it was a period of time.
That's horror for them. Oh my God, no.
I don't know about you guys. We had a party line for a while, and you only picked the phone up if it rang once. If it rang twice, that was somebody else on your phone at another house. And so if you picked it up and there was a conversation going on, you politely hung up, and when they heard the click on the other end, they'd say, "Oh, somebody else wants the phone." So now you have
yeah.
And I remember television. I hated television. My father stopped throwing the ball with me. He went to sit and watch the stupid box.
Now, you had Bob was in the, so you're talking about the Vietnam War a little bit here. We're going to have a couple minutes, but you wanted to acknowledge the first people who died and the last people who got out.
Yeah.
Who died right before, they died.
Sure.
They died, yeah.
Absolutely. I think all too often we forget our heroes, and heroes change in every generation. But Vietnam was a war that nobody really wanted, but we just stayed there. And again, goes back to talking about who made money off of it. Southeast Asia, I mean, it was a mess for so many years, and eventually we know how it ended. But so I had friends. My dad was actually stationed over there during the Tet Offensive before he retired. He went in during Korea and got out after Vietnam, but the point was it was very personal for me. And I have friends that I went to school with that had served in Vietnam, and they did not get the kind of welcome home that our vets get today. And I mean, you can't thank a person enough for going over to a foreign country and doing your job, even if you hated it. When vets came back from Vietnam, they were spit on, they were cussed, they were called baby killers. They couldn't get through airports without harassment, and it was a totally different life back then. As a ROTC student, we used to have to wear uniforms to school on Thursdays. That was drill day, and I remember the scorn I got as an 18-year-old freshman. As a Marine option midshipman, and I thought, God, I'm trying to fight for your rights here, and you're treating me like I'm a pedophile or something. So it was a totally different time. And the point I was making with that is a lot of people lost their lives over the time that we were there, and indigenous folks as well. A lot more South Vietnamese people lost their lives either trying to help us or because they got caught up in the communist push going south. And then Laos, Cambodia, I mean, that violence spilled over to those other countries. And so the part about this is I know his name's not Mark and he's not the son of Fireman, but I know a guy who stood the wall at Saigon that day in April 1975, and it wasn't Bob. Bob was an intelligence guy. He wasn't there. It was another guy that talked about the terror, talked about the torn feelings, like here's people that we came to help that we're going to leave them and they'll be dead in 24 hours because the North Vietnamese are going to come in here and shoot them or put them in re-education camps. And the feeling that he spoke about, I wanted to make sure that some of that came across. And in those last few hours, the ability to get people in and out of there, I mean, the diplomatic mission was going down the toilet, and it was now a military mission to get those people out. And the work that went into making that happen, most people had forgotten about or never even knew. And so that chapter 8 that's in the book that talks about that, that's not me making stuff up. That's the people that were in Saigon in 1975. Nice. That's their recollection.
I hate to interrupt, but we're down to the last minute. Make sure everybody knows how to get their book and where to reach you.
Sure. Yeah, it's available on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, and Ingram. I appreciate the promo that you put on your website, so by all means, check the website. Gosh.
What's the name of the book again?
The name of the book is That Shining Moment. And That Shining Moment, you'll find out if you read all the way through it. We explain where that title comes from in like the last chapter, so you have to read the whole thing.
Read the whole thing, find out why you named it. Well, thank you. I think our music is coming on. That's been a great show. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward. We'll get the book and read it. And we'll have you back again someday.
Yeah, thank you for your service and research.
Yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a bunch, and safe travels to you.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio.